Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here, and this particular video will contain some of the information on violentization theory and terrorism. To back up, what I'm going to do is apply Lonnie Athens' work on violentization theory to terrorism. I highly recommend that you read Lonnie Athens' books and articles, and also there are other secondary sources that you may refer to that use Dr. Athens' work. In most of my work, I have applied violentization theory to genocide, and now I'm going to move to try to apply it to terrorism. So we'll see how it goes. There's basically 4 stages of violentization processes, and there's been one additional one that my colleagues and I have added. And basically the stages are brutalization, defiance, violent dominance engagements, virulency, and extreme virulency. And I'll go over those in more detail. Of course, what we want to do is apply these to terrorism. Lonnie Athens talked about the phantom community, and in his work he states that the phantom community provides people with a multi but unified voice and sounding board for making sense of their varied social experiences. So in other words, this is the internal dialogue that people have to make interpretations, to understand situations, and then act. In the case of terrorism, we have people who interact and understand this whole idea of using what we call terrorism for particular purposes. This explains the motivations, the rationale, the reasoning, the methodology, the support system, and so forth. The rationalizations, and everything that would go into the decision-making process of committing a terrorist act or encouraging others to commit terrorism. Because one of the things I still have to address in my own work is the application of violentization to leaders and to followers, from those who carry out the violent behavior versus those who go ahead and encourage and lead others to engage in the violent behavior. We also need to take a look at the self-image and how a person's and a group's self-image changes over time. So we basically can get the notion here that there are nonviolent individuals who can become dangerous and violent killers. Likewise, there are those that have engaged in violent behavior that could be theoretically re-socialized to become peaceful citizens. Now, looking at the violentization codes that we used in our work on genocide, I'll go over these and then maybe try to apply a little bit of this to terrorism. This is very preliminary work, so I encourage you to take a very critical assessment at this work. I hope it is innovative, but at the same time I don't have supporting research. So you really need to be critical of my work. It may work, it may not work. Certainly I do not have any of the final answers, and again, this is preliminary, so I mentioned that in advance. The brutalization stage focuses on teaching and demonstrating violent behavior, and so in this particular scenario applied to terrorism, we would have a stage where people are taught and are shown how to understand terrorism, how to engage in terrorism, basically how to use terrorism to threaten others. Also, the individuals may be exposed to other terrorist activities or exposed to violence and be taught that terrorism is an appropriate response to whatever particular violent activities or even nonviolent activities. And also, one is told and encouraged to engage in terrorism. They're told that they have a personal responsibility to engage in terrorist activities. Moving from the brutalization, we go into the defiance stage, where the idea of carrying out terrorist acts or supporting terrorism is encouraged and viewed as appropriate behavior. There may also be the integration of an idea, even if it's totally irrational, that the person or group either needs to kill or be killed, or needs to carry out this act, or else there will be dire consequences. In the third stage, violent dominant engagements, we have the actual encouragement and reinforcement for using the actual violence or carrying out the act. The group or the individual is directed to carry out a terroristic activity based on the belief systems, the ideology that have been imparted and socialized to the individual or group. And they are encouraged and supported to go out there and actually carry out a terrorist act and observe the outcome or result. Of course, in suicide terrorism activities, the group would observe the resulting outcome. The person who engages in suicide terrorism, of course, would, if they were blown up, they would be dead. But the whole idea here is to look at what brought them to that particular point in the violentization process, both leaders and followers. And the virulency stage looks at the belief system that the group is violent and dangerous. And the group, in this case, defines themselves as being dangerous, violent people, and they get support from others who encourage and support their violent activities. Extreme virulency was used in our genocide research as the fifth stage to look at behavior that goes beyond killing the victims. That would include torture, mutilation, sexual violence, and other activities that you might see committed by sadistic serial killers. And in terrorism, you may not see this occur, or you may. In many cases that we have seen, that we see extreme violence perhaps, but we see a rapid terroristic act without prolonged torture of a victim, for example, although we have seen cases where victims are tortured in terrorism. So we want to consider whether or not it reaches the extreme virulency stage. We also want to look at the terrorist self-images and how the phantom community operates to develop, encourage, and maintain those images. How people develop violent self-images and how people develop non-violent self-images. We want to look at all that, because if I'm reading the literature correctly, there's an emerging area of rehabilitation of terrorists, almost a psychotherapy for terrorists. And I don't know a whole lot about this area right now, and I have to read up on it, but I recently saw an entire book was on terrorist rehabilitation. Additionally, Lonnie Athens talked about looking at different types of interpretations to the violence. For example, the first one, physically defensive interpretations, are based on fear and how an attack might be made. The frustrative interpretations are anger-based and focus on resistance and action. The malefic interpretations are hatred-based and focus on negative character of the other and the use of violent responses. And finally, the frustrative malefic interpretations is based on hatred and anger combined. So in the case of the frustrative malefic type, the perpetrator develops a violent plan because he or she views the violence as a legitimate way to deal with an evil person or group. And you can get a lot of this very useful information and case application in Richard Rhodes' book on Why They Kill, which is an excellent overview of Lonnie Athens' work, and another book I highly recommend that is in the references. Why They Killed, The Discoveries of a Maverick Criminologist, which focuses on the life of Lonnie Athens and also his work, which I will mention he still is developing and advancing. So there it is in a very quick, brief overview, violentization theory applied to terrorism. And I think the next step in this is to actually conduct research and to take several case studies of different types of terrorism by different types of terrorist groups and analyze whether or not or how these stages materialize, how they fit or don't fit, and find out using an inductive approach what is going on, looking carefully at the cases and trying to figure out what's going on and seeing if it actually fits the theory, which may be very useful for beginning to think about prevention of terrorism and policy. And so I have PowerPoints available, and if you follow through with the PowerPoints and also the article on genocide and violentization, you can see how I start to use a comparative approach. And this wraps up this podcast. Thank you. I'm sorry, this video. Thank you.